Welcome to Heartbreak Chronicles. The air conditioning in the courtroom hummed with monotonous persistence, yet it couldn't dispel the tension suspended between opposing sides. Magnus sat in the plaintiff's section, back straight, chin slightly raised, hands neatly folded on the oak table before him. At 41, his temples had already begun to gray, not from age, but from 18 months of meticulously calculated stress. Across the aisle, Serafina leaned back casually in her chair with deliberate nonchalance. Her crimson blazer stood out starkly against the courtroom's muted tones, like a declaration of war. At 36, she remained as stunning as when Magnus first met her, at least on the surface. Whatever beauty Magnus had once seen beneath that surface had withered, replaced by something cold and calculating. Beside her sat Cashin, her attorney. This man's $1,000 tailored suit and perfectly manicured nails silently proclaimed a privilege not earned through effort, but inherited. The contemptuous smile playing at his lips as he flipped through documents made Magnus' stomach churn, but he maintained his composure. "Your Honor," Cashin rose with exaggerated confidence. "As outlined in our petition, Ms. Serafina is entitled to half of all marital assets, including the business Magnus established during the marriage. The prenuptial agreement was signed under duress and should be deemed invalid." Judge Cordelia Thorne, who had sat on the bench for 30 years with permanent skepticism etched on her face, peered at Cashin over her reading glasses. "Mr. Cashin, I've heard your arguments, but I haven't heard substantial evidence of this alleged duress." Cashin's confidence remained unshaken. "Your Honor, my client was vulnerable at the time, deeply in love." Judge Thorne interrupted him, raising an eyebrow. Scattered laughter rippled through the courtroom. Magnus didn't join them. He wasn't here for entertainment. Cashin cleared his throat. "Ms. Serafina sacrificed her career prospects to support her husband's business ventures. She was busy spending my money," Magnus said quietly, just loud enough for his own attorney to hear. Benedict Ashworth, a silver-haired man with piercing eyes who had made countless opponents retreat during his 30-year career, placed a steady hand on Magnus' arm. "Patience," he whispered, "our moment is coming." Across the aisle, Serafina leaned toward Cashin, whispering something that made him smile. She caught Magnus' eye, staring directly at him with lips curved in a false smile. "You should smile more, Magnus," she called across the courtroom divide. "After all, it's just money." A murmur rose from the gallery. Judge Thorne tapped her gavel. "Ms. Serafina, please address the court, not your spouse." Cashin adjusted his tie. "As I was saying, Your Honor, my client is entitled to half of everything, including shares in Magnus Enterprises valued at approximately $12 million. The primary residence valued at $2.5 million, and various investments and assets totaling approximately $3 million. Serafina's eyes gleamed at these figures. "We also seek exclusive rights to the Aspen vacation property and both vehicles, considering Magnus can easily replace them through his business connections." Judge Thorne took notes, then looked toward Benedict. "Mr. Ashworth, your response." Benedict rose slowly and deliberately, a man who understood the power of well-timed pauses. "Your Honor, we've sat quietly listening to Mr. Cashin's creative interpretation of law and facts. Now we'd like to submit evidence that will render these proceedings meaningless." Cashin scoffed. "Your Honor, if they had exonerating evidence, they would have submitted it during discovery. This evidence," Benedict continued unperturbed, "only came into our possession last night. It directly relates to legal ethical issues affecting these proceedings." Judge Thorne frowned. Counsel approached the bench. As the attorneys walked toward the judge's bench, Magnus caught Serafina's eye again. The false smile had vanished, replaced by the first flicker of uncertainty. Good. He wanted her to feel that unease, that first premonition that she might have misjudged the situation. After intense whispered conversation, Judge Thorne nodded. "I'll allow the submission. Mr. Magnus, would you like to address the court?" Magnus stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he rose. He walked to the center of the courtroom with steady steps. "Your Honor, for the past year and a half, I've watched my wife attempt to dismantle everything I've built. Today, I'd like to submit this as evidence." He turned to Benedict, who handed him a thick manila envelope. Magnus approached the bench, placing it before the judge with steady hands. Judge Thorne opened the envelope and began reading, her expression unchanged. But as her eyes moved across the pages, her brow furrowed. She looked first at Magnus, then at Serafina and Cashin. "Mr. Cashin, are you aware of the contents of this document?" Cashin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I haven't had the opportunity to review it, Your Honor." "Then perhaps you should." She handed the first page to the bailiff, who delivered it to Cashin. As he read, his face turned pale. He glanced at Serafina in alarm, who snatched the paper from his hands. Her reaction was exactly what Magnus had imagined during countless sleepless nights. Eyes widening, lips parting, sudden violent shaking of her head. This is fabricated," she stammered. "He's lying. The accompanying photographs and financial records suggest otherwise, Miss Serafina," Judge Thorne said, her tone icy. "Mr. Ashworth, given this evidence, what exactly are you requesting?" Benedict stepped forward. "Given the proven fraud and misconduct, we request immediate dismissal of Ms. Serafina's claims and enforcement of the prenuptial agreement as written." Judge Thorne nodded slowly. "I'm declaring a 1-hour recess to thoroughly review these materials. When we reconvene, I expect both parties to be prepared to address these allegations specifically." As she rose, whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. Serafina rushed toward Magnus, her composure completely shattered, face twisted with rage. "What did you do?" she hissed. Magnus stepped back, maintaining distance. "I didn't do anything, Serafina. This is the result of your own actions." Cashin grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Not here," he warned. "We need to talk now." As they hurried from the courtroom, Magnus allowed himself the slightest smile. Phase 1 was complete. Benedict gathered his documents. "Going well," he said quietly, "but don't celebrate yet. Thorne is thorough. She'll want to verify everything." "Everything is legitimate," Magnus assured him. "Every signature, every transfer, every photograph." Benedict nodded. "Then let's get some coffee. This will be a long day." As they walked through the courthouse corridors, Magnus felt lighter than he had in months. The reckoning had begun, and when it ended, Serafina would have nothing left but regret. 6 months earlier, Magnus sat in his home office, the glow from his monitors the only illumination in the dark room. It was past midnight, the third consecutive night he'd worked until dawn. Not because Magnus Enterprises needed it, but because going to bed meant lying beside Serafina, and that had become its own form of torture. The spreadsheet before him listed assets, accounts, properties, a comprehensive display of the life he'd built. A life that until recently he'd thought was shared. The initial signs had been subtle. Dinner conversations grew flat. Serafina's phone would flip face down whenever he entered a room. Weekend plans increasingly excluded him. Working late again? Serafina's voice from the doorway startled him. Magnus minimized the spreadsheet. "Just finishing up," he said without turning to look at her. She moved behind him, placing her hands on his shoulders. Once, her touch would have brought comfort. Now, he had to suppress the urge to shake off her hands. "You've been distant lately," she said, her tone casual yet probing. "Have I?" Magnus finally turned to face her. "I could say the same about you." Serafina's expression remained neutral, but her hands slipped from his shoulders. "I've been busy. The Foundation's annual gala is being planned by the event coordinator you specifically hired to handle details, so you wouldn't have to," Magnus countered. "Try another excuse." A flicker of annoyance crossed her features, quickly masked by a smile. "Are you monitoring me now?" "Should I be?" She laughed, the sound hollow. "Don't be paranoid, Magnus. It doesn't suit you." She leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Maybe we both need a break. I've been thinking about spending a few days at the lake house." "Alone? Alone?" Magnus studied her, observing carefully. "I need some space to think," she shrugged. "We both do." Magnus nodded slowly. "When?" "This weekend. I'm leaving Friday morning." He turned back to his computer, reopening the spreadsheet. Fine. Hope you find what you're looking for. She hesitated, seeming to expect an argument, then left without another word. Her perfume lingered in the air, jasmine, with something sharper underneath. Something new and unfamiliar. Magnus picked up his phone and texted his sister. She's going to the lake house Friday. Time to move. The reply came within seconds. Tracking device in place. Cameras installed. We'll monitor. Magnus closed his eyes, fighting the nausea that came with this level of calculation. When had his marriage become a tactical operation? The answer lay scattered across a trail of betrayals. Hotel charges on credit card bills for places they'd never stayed together. Late-night calls she'd explain as foundation emergency work, calls that never seemed to come when he was out of earshot. Then, 3 weeks ago, the confirmation he didn't want but needed. A text message sent to him by mistake instead of its intended recipient. He suspects nothing. We're still on for Thursday. That night, holding his phone, eyes burning with a question he couldn't ask directly, he confronted her. Wrong number, she said with careless laughter. A board member from the foundation. We're meeting to discuss funding allocation. A perfectly reasonable explanation, except Magnus had already verified there was no foundation meeting that Thursday. When he pointed this out, Serafina's demeanor changed. Are you spying on me? She demanded, indignation replacing nonchalance. Going through my phone, calling my colleagues? The ensuing argument became about his lack of trust, his controlling behavior, his paranoia, everything except the truth. By the end, he found himself apologizing, promising to do better, to be more trusting. That night, as Serafina slept beside him, Magnus realized a fundamental truth. The woman he'd married simply didn't exist. Perhaps never had. The next morning, he called Benedict Ashworth, his attorney, and the closest thing he had to a friend. Now, as the clock on his monitor jumped past 1 a.m., Magnus opened a new document and typed a heading at the top, Contingency Plan. If Serafina was playing a game, he would play it better. If she wanted war, he'd give her war. But unlike her, he wouldn't underestimate his opponent. By dawn, the plan was complete. By the weekend, when Serafina left for the lake house to think, the first pieces were in position. Throughout Friday, as he sat in meetings and reviewed contracts, his phone buzzed with updates from his sister Isadora. She arrived at 11:30. Not alone. Male companion, taking photos. An hour later, it's him, attorney Cashin. They're definitely not discussing legal matters. By evening, Magnus had a photo folder that made his stomach turn but hardened his resolve. His wife and her attorney captured in embraces that eliminated any pretense of professional boundaries. But when Serafina returned Sunday night with a forced smile and vague stories about clearing her head, Magnus met her with equal pretense. Feeling better? He asked, pouring her a glass of her preferred wine. Much better, she said, accepting the glass. Sometimes you just need to step back from everything, you know. I know. He clinked his glass lightly against hers. To clear heads. Her smile wavered slightly, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. To clear heads, she echoed. They sipped in silence, two liars marking their territory with half-truths. But only one knew the endgame had begun. The following Wednesday, Magnus returned from a business lunch to find an envelope on his desk. Inside were divorce papers. The petition claimed irreconcilable differences, but included a settlement proposal that was anything but standard. She wanted everything: the house, cars, vacation property, and most devastatingly, 50% of Magnus Enterprises. That evening when he confronted her, Serafina didn't even pretend anymore. It's been over for years, Magnus, she said, arms crossed, standing in their bedroom doorway. We both know that. What about the settlement? He asked, holding up the documents. You think you're entitled to half of my company, one you've never worked a day for? She laughed, the expression not reaching her eyes. I'm entitled to half of everything we built during the marriage. That's the law. Magnus laughed, a bitter sound. What exactly did you contribute, Serafina, besides spending money I earned? Her expression hardened. I supported you. I played the perfect wife at every business dinner, every client meeting. I built relationships that helped secure deals. That's fantasy, and you know it. Magnus shook his head. You attended events when it suited you, talked to people who interested you, then left early when you got bored. Believe what you want to believe, she shrugged. The court will see it differently. Women like me, who sacrifice their careers to support their husbands, are sympathetic figures, especially when those husbands spend more time at the office than at home. The calculation in her voice chilled him. This wasn't a recent decision. This was a plan long in the making. How long have you been working with Cashin? He asked calmly. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, then she controlled it. He's an excellent attorney with an outstanding record in high-asset divorce cases. That's not what I asked. She sneered. Be careful, Magnus. False accusations about my legal counsel won't play well in court. I'm not the one who needs to be careful, he replied, his tone matching hers. You made one critical mistake, Serafina, which is, you think you know me. You placed the divorce papers on the nightstand. You don't. That night, he slept in the guest room. The next morning, he moved into a downtown apartment he'd quietly purchased 3 weeks prior, an address Serafina didn't even know existed. From then on, the real work began. Baxter Law Firm occupied the entire 38th floor of the glass tower that dominated the downtown skyline. Magnus sat in the conference room facing Benedict, floor-to-ceiling windows providing a panoramic view of the city. On the table between them, spread documents painted a picture of papers that would redefine Magnus' future. Have you considered a less aggressive approach? Benedict asked, leaning back in his chair. Divorce is painful enough without turning it into total war. Magnus' gaze remained fixed on the documents. She fired the first shot. She chose Cashin, a man known for extreme tactics. She's sleeping with him, using him to manipulate the legal system. He looked up. Do you really believe she'd settle for anything less than my complete destruction? Benedict sighed. No. From what you've shown me, she wants blood. Then we need to be prepared to strike first. Magnus pushed a folder across the table. I've already begun implementing certain safeguards. Benedict raised an eyebrow as he opened the folder. As he read, his expression remained neutral, but Magnus noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, surprise, or perhaps concern. This is aggressive, Benedict said finally, closing the folder. But if executed correctly, it's legal. It will be. Magnus leaned forward. I've spent my life building systems that can foresee problems before they arise. This is no different, except this problem isn't market volatility or supply chain disruption. It's your wife. Benedict's voice softened. Magnus, are you certain you want to go down this path? Once initiated, she's been planning this for at least a year, Magnus interrupted. Maybe longer. The foundation she insisted on creating, its account structure designed to hide transfers to personal holdings she established in the Caymans. The art collection she's been curating for our home, purchased with our joint funds, but all in her name. Benedict frowned. How do you know this? I hired investigators the day after I saw that text message. Then I started looking myself. Bank records, property transfers, unusual patterns in our expenses. Magnus' mouth twisted into a grim smile. She was clever, but she was careless. Arrogant. She didn't think I'd notice, or if I did, that I wouldn't understand what I was seeing. But you did notice. Numbers don't lie, Benedict. People do. Benedict nodded slowly. All right, if you're certain this is the path you want to take, I'll help you navigate it. But understand, the asset transfers you're proposing, the restructuring, need to happen quickly and be absolutely airtight. I've already started. Magnus pulled out his phone, opened an app, and pushed it across the table. The house has been placed in an irrevocable trust with my niece as beneficiary. This trust was created 3 years ago as part of legitimate estate planning. Serafina even signed the documents, though I doubt she read them. Benedict examined the documents on the phone. What about Magnus Enterprises? My sister Isadora has always been a silent partner. She provided the initial funding when I started. On paper, I only own 49%. The remaining 51% is held by a holding company that, as of yesterday, transferred full ownership to Isadora. She agreed to this. She suggested it. Magnus' expression softened briefly. Isadora understands what loyalty means. And your liquid assets? Legally transferred to offshore accounts established before the marriage. Again, part of estate planning she never bothered to understand. Benedict handed back the phone. You're thorough, but Serafina's team will fight this. They'll claim these transfers were made to defraud her of marital property. Let them try. Magnus' voice hardened. Every transaction is documented and properly backdated. Every signature is authentic. Every transfer follows patterns established years ago. There are also photos, evidence of her affair with Cashin, continuing to accumulate. They're not particularly discreet. Besides the lake house, they've met at Harbor View Hotel twice, at his downtown apartment, at least weekly. I have time-stamped photos, hotel receipts, even audio in some cases. Benedict leaned forward, his expression serious. Marcus, listen to me carefully. What we're doing walks the edge of legality. It's legal asset protection, but only if executed precisely. One misstep, and you could face serious consequences. I understand the risks. Do you really? Because from where I'm sitting, this doesn't look like legal strategy. It looks like justice. Justice. Magnus picked up the word. This is about justice, Benedict. She betrayed our vows. She betrayed basic decency. She's trying to steal what I've built my entire life. His voice remained calm, but his hands had clenched into fists. I won't let her win. Not this time. Benedict studied him for a long moment. This isn't just about money or the business, is it? Magnus' jaw tightened. What else would it be about? You loved her once. The words hung in the air between them. A truth Magnus had tried to bury under spreadsheets and legal maneuvers. Yes, he finally admitted, I did love her, but love without respect is worthless. Love without honesty is a lie. He straightened in his chair. I'm not doing this because I love her. I'm doing this because she thinks she can use that love against me. Magnus sat in his BMW, positioned for a clear view of Harbor View Hotel's private entrance. The leather seats had become uncomfortable during his 3-hour wait, but discomfort was a small price for certainty. His phone buzzed on the console. Another message from Isadora. He quickly replied with a negative, then returned to his surveillance. This wasn't the first surveillance he'd conducted, but it was the first time he'd insisted on doing it personally. The private investigators he'd hired were thorough, but some things a man needed to see with his own eyes. A sleek black Audi pulled up to the entrance. Cashin emerged, straightened his tie, and handed his keys to the valet. Even from a distance, Magnus could see the man's smug smile as he checked his watch. 20 minutes later, a taxi arrived. Serafina got out, wearing oversized sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Magnus noted that the casual shirt and jeans she'd worn at home had been replaced by a form-fitting dress. A strategic choice that made his stomach turn. Through his telephoto lens, Magnus captured a series of photographs. Serafina entering the hotel, Cashin greeting her in the lobby, kissing her in a way that was decidedly not client-attorney. Their hands intertwined as they walked toward the elevator. He lowered the camera, a strange calm settling over him. There was relief in seeing suspicions confirmed, in watching the last illusion crumble. The woman walking into that hotel wasn't just betraying her husband. She was mocking the legal system itself. Got them, he texted Isadora, attaching a photo, arrived separately. Met at hotel. Need me to call with a fake emergency so you can leave? She replied. No, I need to witness all of it. Magnus settled into wait, checking emails on his tablet. 2 hours later, Cashin emerged alone, looking disheveled despite his expensive suit. 30 minutes after that, Serafina appeared, hair restyled, lipstick reapplied. The performance skills Magnus had once admired now stood exposed as weapons in her arsenal of deception. His phone rang. Andrew Miller on the caller ID. I'm assuming you're not at the office, Benedict said when Magnus answered. Just finishing some personal business, Magnus replied, starting his car as Serafina's taxi drove away. What's happening? Cashin just filed additional motions in your case. He's seeking emergency hearings for temporary alimony and exclusive use of the residence. Magnus laughed, a short, bitter sound. Interesting timing. Magnus. Benedict's voice sharpened. Tell me you haven't done anything that could compromise our position. I'm gathering evidence, Benedict. Evidence showing my wife has an improper relationship with her legal counsel. Evidence that said counsel is using that relationship to manipulate legal proceedings for both their benefit. A heavy sigh came through the phone. While I appreciate your initiative, this kind of surveillance could backfire if not handled properly. It's being handled properly, Magnus assured him, following Serafina's taxi at a careful distance. The photographer is licensed. The footage was obtained in public places or where there's no expectation of privacy. Everything is time-stamped and authenticated. What exactly do you plan to do with this evidence? Magnus watched Serafina's taxi turn toward their neighborhood. No, her neighborhood now. He'd moved out weeks ago, though he still kept clothes there and occasionally stayed overnight to maintain appearances. Exactly what you'd expect, he said. File an ethics complaint against Cashin. Use the conflict of interest to get him removed from the case. Ensure the judge knows exactly who they're dealing with. What if that doesn't work? Judges have seen worse and not blinked. Then we move to Plan B. Magnus' voice hardened. We make it personal. The silence on the other end stretched until Benedict finally spoke. I want to ask what that means. Just assure me you won't cross any legal lines. I can defend aggressive tactics, but not illegal actions. Everything I do will be completely legal, Magnus promised. Perhaps unethical, but no more so than what they've done. After hanging up, Magnus continued following the taxi until it turned onto the street where his house stood. A 7-year-old modernist masterpiece of glass and steel that had once represented everything he'd achieved. Now it was just another battlefield. He parked 2 blocks away, watching Serafina enter the house. Through the large windows, he could see her moving through the foyer, phone pressed to her ear, likely reporting to Cashin that their latest scheme had been executed. His own phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Emergency hearing scheduled. Magnus versus Serafina." The date was set for 3 days hence. They were trying to accelerate the process, hoping to gain advantage before he could properly respond. A classic move from Cashin's playbook, designed to pressure opponents into unfavorable settlements. Magnus smiled grimly. They still thought they were dealing with an ordinary man, someone wounded by betrayal and desperate to avoid public exposure. They had no idea what was coming. He started the car and drove toward his downtown apartment, a minimalist space lacking all the personal touches that had once made his house a home. But it served its purpose, a command center from which to wage private war. Upon entering, he spread the day's photographs across the dining table, reviewing each with clinical detachment. Then he opened his laptop, logged into a secure server, and added them to the ever-growing file labeled S+C evidence. Next, he dialed a number not saved in his contacts. "This is Garrett," a gravelly voice answered. "It's Magnus. I need information on Cashin, not just about the affair. Professional or personal, anything that would get the state bar's attention." Magnus paused, and anything that might explain his sudden interest in Magnus Enterprises. "You think there's more?" Cashin specializes in high-asset divorces, but he usually pursues quick settlements with minimal exposure. This aggressive approach isn't his style unless there's something specific he wants. "I'll look into it," Garrett promised. "My usual rate. Double it if you find something substantial within 48 hours. After ending the call, Magnus walked to his home office wall, where a complex chart was pinned, a map of connections, properties, accounts, and relationships. At the center were 2 photographs, Serafina and Cashin. Around them, a web extended outward, encompassing their known associates, financial holdings, and behavioral patterns. He added a new note beside Cashin's image. "Emergency hearing seeking residence plus temp alimony." Why the rush? Then he stepped back, studying the complete picture. Some would call it obsessive. Magnus preferred thorough. In business, he learned that patterns revealed intentions. People telegraphed their moves long before taking action, if one knew how to read the signals. And Magnus had become very good at reading signals where Serafina was concerned. His phone buzzed again. "Isadora." Serafina just called the foundation asking if they could expedite quarterly disbursements to her personal project fund. "They told her it had to go through you first." Magnus frowned. The foundation, Serafina's pet project he'd funded 3 years ago as an anniversary gift, operated independently, but required joint approval for major financial decisions. Her personal project fund was supposedly for mentoring underprivileged women in business. In reality, it functioned as her private slush fund with minimal oversight. "Tell them to delay," he replied. "Say I'm traveling and can't approve large transfers until next week." Already done. She wasn't happy. Threatened to call an emergency board meeting to override you. Let her try. The bylaws require 72 hours notice for any meeting. By then, we'll have had our hearing. He added another note to the chart. Seeking quick cash, foundation channel. The pattern was becoming clearer. Serafina needed money, and she needed it fast. The question was why. He turned his laptop and opened a specialized program designed for financial analysts. He entered the access codes for Serafina's personal accounts, which as her husband and primary account holder, he was authorized to access. Ethically questionable perhaps, but no more so than her actions. The program displayed her recent transactions, highlighting unusual patterns. Nothing immediately suspicious appeared, but a series of cash withdrawals over the past month totaled nearly $50,000. Small enough individually to avoid triggering alerts, but significant in aggregate. He photographed the screen, adding the image to his evidence file, then logged out. Another piece of the puzzle, though he wasn't sure yet where it fit. A notification appeared on his phone. The house's security system had been activated. Serafina was out again. He checked the time, 8:47 p.m. Too late for foundation business. Too early for dinner. Another meeting with Cashin? Perhaps. He considered following her again, but decided against it. Garrett would handle tonight's surveillance. Magnus had other preparations to make for the emergency hearing. Opening his safe, he retrieved a small recording device and a USB drive. The recorder contained conversations between him and Serafina over the past month, where she'd inadvertently revealed aspects of her strategy. The USB drive contained financial records that contradicted statements she'd filed with the court. Tomorrow, he would turn both over to Benedict. The day after, they would be ready for whatever Cashin and Serafina might throw at them in court. Magnus poured 2 fingers of whiskey and walked to the window. From his 32nd floor apartment, the city spread before him, a tapestry of lights against the twilight. Somewhere out there, Serafina was plotting his downfall, confident in her ability to defeat him. He raised his glass in a silent toast. Let her plot. Let her scheme. In the end, only one person would be left standing, and Magnus had no intention of falling. The emergency hearing proceeded exactly as Magnus had anticipated, a performance of Cashin's theatrical dramatics versus Benedict's cool professionalism. The judge wasn't swayed by either side's urgency, ordering maintenance of the status quo until proper financial disclosures could be reviewed, no exclusive use of the residence, no emergency alimony payments. A small victory, but not the decisive blow Magnus sought. Now, 2 weeks later, he sat across from Isadora in a private booth at Vesper, an upscale Italian restaurant frequented by the city's business elite. His sister, 3 years his senior and infinitely more cynical, cut her salmon with surgical precision. She tried to access the Aspen property yesterday, Isadora said after a few bites. The management company called to verify her authorization, and the new security protocols flagged her attempt. Magnus nodded, making a note on his phone. They followed the script exactly? Very apologetic. But unfortunately, Miss Serafina's access has been temporarily suspended pending owner review. That would be me. Of course, they didn't specify that part. What was her reaction? Isadora smiled thinly. According to the manager, and I quote, like someone had just told her dog died. Demanded to speak with you directly. When that didn't work, threatened legal action. Let her try. Magnus muttered. The property was purchased before our marriage. Never been in joint names. She might not know that, Isadora pointed out. You were never one to discuss the details of your assets, even with your wife. Especially with my wife, as it turns out. He set down his fork, appetite diminished. Any movement on the credit cards? Isadora pulled out her tablet, tapped through several screens, then turned it toward him. 4 attempts to use the platinum card in the past week. All declined. She hasn't tried the other cards yet. The screen showed attempted transactions at Bergdorf Goodman, an upscale restaurant, a jewelry store, and most recently, a luxury car dealership. Car dealership? Magnus raised an eyebrow. Maserati specifically. Isadora's tone was dry. Apparently, she's shopping for a new car, a modest $70,000 upgrade from her current Mercedes, which is still in my name. Along with the insurance, Magnus noted. Speaking of which, Isadora swiped to another screen. I've modified the insurance, as you requested. The Mercedes is still covered, but only with you as the driver. Anyone else is no longer insured. Has she noticed? Not yet. But if she gets pulled over or, God forbid, has an accident, she will. Isadora studied him over the rim of her wine glass. You're playing a dangerous game, little brother. I'm protecting what's mine, bit by bit, withdrawing her financial support. Like a high-stakes game of Jenga. She set down her glass. Don't misunderstand me. I'm fully supportive of destroying her. I just want you to recognize the risk. Push too hard too fast, and she might realize what's happening before all the pieces are in place. Magnus leaned back, considering. You're right. We need to maintain the illusion that her frustrations are isolated incidents, not a coordinated campaign. Exactly. Credit card declined? Must be a processing error. Access to the Aspen house revoked? Security update glitch. Foundation funding delayed? Administrative oversight. And when all these accidents accumulate? Isadora asked. Magnus' smile was sharp as a blade. By then, it'll be too late for her to recover. Their conversation was interrupted by the waiter entering to clear plates and offer dessert. Both declined, requesting only coffee. When they were alone again, Isadora lowered her voice. Garrett sent the preliminary report on Cashin. Magnus straightened. Interesting, to say the least. She slid a folder across the table, partially concealed under a napkin. Your instinct was right. Cashin's interest in Magnus Enterprises goes beyond divorce settlement. Magnus opened the folder, quickly scanning the contents. Halfway through, his eyes narrowed. He's representing Meridian Partners in acquisition talks, he said, looking up sharply. That's a direct conflict of interest. Isadora nodded. Meridian has been trying to acquire Magnus Enterprises for 18 months. Their last offer was rejected by the board 6 weeks before Serafina filed for divorce. Rejected by you. Magnus' jaw tightened. If Serafina gets half the company in the divorce, she can force a sale to Meridian. And Cashin collects fees from both transactions, Isadora concluded. Does Serafina know? Unknown. Garrett's still investigating. But here's the interesting part. Isadora pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the page. Cashin's firm is in financial trouble. 3 partners left last quarter, taking major clients with them. He needs a big win. The waiter returned with coffee. Magnus waited until they were alone again to respond. So his aggressive approach isn't just his standard playbook. It's desperation. He sipped his coffee, mind racing. This changes everything. We need to accelerate. Accelerate what specifically? Isadora's tone was cautious. The house mortgage, Magnus said. From suspension to active foreclosure proceedings. Isadora's eyebrows flew up. That's nuclear level, Magnus. Once the process begins, it can be stopped just as easily, he countered. But it will force her to act. If she's busy trying to save the house, she won't have time to focus on the business aspects of the divorce. What if she calls your bluff? It's not a bluff. The mortgage is now held by Horizon Capital, your company. 3 months of missed payments. I've been making them until now. Constitutes ground for foreclosure. Isadora studied him for a long moment. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Not everything, Magnus admitted, but enough. Cashin wants Magnus Enterprises. Serafina wants the money that would come from selling to Meridian. Neither of them will get what they want. What about you? Isadora asked gently. What do you want when this is all over? Magnus' expression hardened. Justice. Justice and revenge aren't the same thing, little brother. In this case, they are. He closed the folder and handed it back to her. Initiate the foreclosure proceedings. Have Garrett continue investigating Cashin's connections to Meridian. I want every detail, every meeting, every communication. 3 days later, Magnus watched from his car as a courier delivered the foreclosure notice to the house. Through binoculars, he observed Serafina's expression as she opened the envelope on the front steps. A series of emotions, confusion, disbelief, rage, played across her face like scenes from a familiar movie. She immediately pulled out her phone, undoubtedly calling Cashin. Her gestures became animated, her free hand slicing through the air as she paced across the porch. Magnus' phone buzzed with a text from Benedict. Just got angry call from Cashin. Foreclosure notice. Demanding immediate meeting. How do you want to respond? Tell him we're unavailable until next week, Magnus replied. Cite prior commitments that can't be rescheduled. This will escalate things, Benedict warned. That's the plan. Magnus lowered the binoculars, watching Serafina storm back into the house. The first shock had been felt. Now to wait for the aftershocks. He didn't have to wait long. That evening, as he worked in his apartment, his security system alerted him to an unexpected visitor. The lobby cameras showed Serafina arguing with the doorman, waving what looked like legal documents. Minutes later, his phone rang. Mr. Magnus, the doorman said, there's a lady here claiming to be your wife. She's insisting on coming up to your unit. My soon-to-be ex-wife, Magnus corrected calmly. Does she have keys to the building? No, sir. Then she has no authorization to enter. Please inform her that if she has documents to serve, she can do so through proper legal channels. Yes, sir. Would you like me to call security? Magnus considered. Not yet. Give her the option to leave the documents with you for service. If she refuses or becomes disruptive, then yes, please involve security. He ended the call and moved to the window that provided a partial view of the building entrance. 5 minutes later, Serafina emerged, face flushed with anger. She looked up, scanning the windows as if she could determine his location through sheer force of will. Magnus' phone rang again. Serafina. He let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message she left. You think you're so clever with this foreclosure nonsense. Her voice was full of rage. Did you forget I can access all our accounts? I know exactly what you're doing, Magnus. Cashin says this is borderline illegal. I'm going to fight back. You can't just hide assets and pretend the house isn't marital property. Call me back, or our next conversation will be in front of a judge. He saved the message, more evidence of her unstable emotional state, then turned to his computer. His email showed a new message from Garrett, marked urgent. The subject line read, Secret meeting confirmed. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. at Meridian offices. The body contained only an attachment. A calendar invitation forwarded from Cashin's email account to Serafina, confirming a meeting with Meridian Partners CEO to discuss potential acquisition opportunities. Magnus forwarded the email to Benedict with a brief message, smoking gun. Within minutes, his phone rang. Where did you get this? Benedict asked immediately upon answering. Does it matter? It absolutely matters if it was illegally obtained, Benedict said sharply. I can't and won't present illegally obtained evidence in court. It was forwarded by a confidential source with legitimate access, Magnus assured him. The source can be established if necessary. Benedict sighed audibly. This is a major conflict of interest. Cashin representing both Serafina in your divorce, and Meridian in attempting to acquire your company. The Bar Association will have a field day. Exactly. So what's our next move? We do nothing right now. We let them have their meeting. We let Cashin dig himself deeper into this ethical quagmire. Then, at the appropriate time, we submit this evidence as part of a comprehensive ethics complaint. When is the appropriate time? Magnus pressed. When it will do maximum damage, Benedict replied, his tone hardening. You wanted a war, Magnus. This is how you win wars. Not with impulsive strikes, but with perfectly timed offensives. After ending the call, Magnus returned to his workstation, where a complex timeline of events was displayed across 3 monitors. He added a new entry, Meeting SC and Meridian CEO, Potential Acquisition Discussion. The pieces were aligning perfectly. Under financial pressure from foreclosure and credit restrictions, Serafina would become increasingly desperate for a quick resolution. Cashin, needing a victory to save his firm's finances, would push harder for a settlement favorable to Meridian's acquisition plans. Both driven by greed and desperation would make mistakes, and Magnus would be waiting to capitalize on every misstep. The tension in the Baxter law firm conference room was palpable. Magnus sat at one end of the oak table with Benedict beside him. Across from them, Seraphina's rigid posture betrayed her anger despite her composed expression. Cashin looked less polished than usual, tie already loosened and sleeves rolled up, the image of a man working around the clock for his client. Between them lay scattered documents, financial disclosures, asset inventories, proposed settlement terms, the remains of a marriage being dismantled piece by piece. This foreclosure action is pure harassment, Cashin said, jabbing the notice with his finger. The mortgage was never in default. Magnus controlled those payments throughout the marriage. The mortgage is now held by Horizon Capital, Benedict replied calmly. Their payment records show 3 missed payments. Whatever arrangements existed with the original lender no longer apply. Horizon Capital, Cashin scoffed, which happens to be owned by Isadora Magnus. This is transparent asset manipulation, and the court will see right through it. Magnus remained silent, observing Seraphina rather than Cashin. Her eyes flicked with each exchange, calculating, reassessing. She was the real threat in the room. Cashin was just her tool. My client has been extremely generous in his proposed settlement, Benedict continued, pushing a document across the table. $50,000 cash, 1 year of health insurance, and full transfer of the Mercedes to Ms. Seraphina. Seraphina laughed, the sound sharp. Generous? You're joking. After 12 years of marriage, he gives me pocket change and expects gratitude. 12 years during which you contributed nothing to asset acquisition. Magnus broke his silence. Nothing to the growth of Magnus Enterprises. Nothing except spending money you didn't earn. I built your social connections, Seraphina snapped. I managed our home, our social calendar, our reputation. You managed your shopping schedule, Magnus corrected, his tone icy. You attended events when it suited you, left early when you got bored, and through your behavior, embarrassed me more often than anything else. Cashin raised a hand. This is unproductive. Let's focus on the legal issues. Fine, Magnus said, leaning forward. Let's discuss your meeting with Meridian Partners yesterday. The change in the room was immediate. Cashin's face went pale. Seraphina's eyes widened briefly before she controlled her reaction. I don't know what you're talking about, Cashin said, too quickly. Benedict opened a folder and withdrew a printed email. This is a calendar invitation between you, Ms. Seraphina, and Christopher Ellis, CEO of Meridian Partners. The subject line read, Potential Acquisition Opportunities. My firm represents many clients, Cashin countered, recovering slightly. Meridian happens to be one of them. There's no conflict. There's a conflict when you're representing Ms. Seraphina in a divorce that could result in her acquiring shares of Magnus Enterprises, shares that Meridian has been trying to purchase for over a year. Benedict's voice remained steady, but his eyes sharpened. This isn't just a conflict of interest. It's an ethics violation that could result in disbarment. Seraphina shot a sharp look at Cashin. You said this was handled. It is handled, Cashin assured her, though his confidence seemed shaken. There's no evidence of any impropriety. One meeting to discuss theoretical scenarios, hardly. We don't just have the invitation, Magnus interrupted. We have photographs of you entering Meridian's offices together. We have recordings of conversations discussing potential sales. We have financial records showing transactions between your firm and Meridian dating back 6 months, well before you began representing Ms. Seraphina. That's impossible, Cashin said sharply. Those conversations were private. Were they? Magnus smiled slightly. Or did you just assume no one was listening? Cashin's face flushed with anger. These materials are being compiled into an ethics complaint that will be filed with the State Bar Association by weekend, Benedict concluded. Unless, of course, we can reach a reasonable settlement today. The silence that followed was deafening. Seraphina and Cashin exchanged glances, a wordless communication Magnus knew well. The look of conspirators realizing their plan was falling apart. "I need to confer with my client," Cashin said finally. "Privately." Benedict nodded. "Of course. Please use the office next door. We'll wait." As they left, Magnus leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The trap had been set, and now they were scrambling to escape. "They'll counterattack," Benedict said quietly once the door closed. "Probably file suits of their own, defamation, invasion of privacy, designed as distractions from the ethics complaint." "Let them come," Magnus replied. "Every move they make will sink them deeper." 20 minutes later, Cashin and Serafina returned. The change in their demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Cashin's forced confidence, Serafina's tightly controlled rage. "We've discussed your allegations," Cashin began. "While we maintain that no ethics violations occurred, we're prepared to offer a counter-settlement to resolve this matter efficiently." Benedict raised an eyebrow. "We're listening." "Ms. Serafina will accept the 50,000, the Mercedes, and the proposed health insurance," Cashin said. "However, she also requires 20% of Magnus Enterprises, non-voting shares only, with no operational involvement." "Impossible," Magnus said immediately. "I don't own Magnus Enterprises. As the financial disclosures clearly show, the company is owned by Isidore Magnus and various minority shareholders. I'm merely an employee. An employee who somehow lives in a multi-million-dollar apartment and drives a $100,000 car," Serafina mocked. "No one will believe that arrangement, Magnus." "What matters isn't what anyone believes," Benedict interjected. "What matters is what can be proven in court. And the ownership structure of Magnus Enterprises has been extensively documented since its incorporation." Cashin leaned forward. "Then let's cut to the chase. If these arrangements are as legitimate as you claim, you won't object to a forensic accounting review of Magnus Enterprises' ownership history and Magnus' personal finances for the past 5 years. By an independent firm of our choosing," Serafina added. Magnus and Benedict exchanged glances. This was the counterattack they'd expected, a fishing expedition disguised as due diligence. "We don't object to forensic review," Benedict said carefully, "provided it's conducted by a mutually agreed-upon firm and limited to ownership transfers directly related to marital assets." "Not good enough," Cashin countered. "We want complete access." "You're not in a position to make demands," Magnus interrupted, his patience thinning. "Not when you're facing an ethics complaint that could end your career. So here's our counteroffer. Ms. Serafina accepts our original proposal, signs a confidentiality agreement regarding all matters related to Magnus Enterprises, and you, Mr. Cashin, voluntarily withdraw from representing her due to your conflict with Meridian." Cashin's face darkened. "That won't happen." "Then neither will your forensic review." Magnus gathered his documents, signaling the discussion was over. "You think you've won?" Serafina said, her voice low and dangerous. "But you've only guaranteed this gets uglier." Magnus met her gaze. "It was always going to get ugly, Serafina. You ensured that when you decided to take what doesn't belong to you." The air conditioning in the courtroom hummed with the same monotonous persistence as 18 months earlier when this war began. Magnus sat in the plaintiff's section, just as before. But now, no Cashin stood beside Serafina. She sat alone, her third attorney having withdrawn from the case days earlier. Judge Thorne looked towards Serafina. "Ms. Serafina, while I understand your frustration with the succession of attorneys who have withdrawn from your case, I must warn you that proceeding without legal representation in such a complex matter is inadvisable." Serafina lifted her chin. "Understand, Your Honor, but I'm prepared to proceed." Judge Thorne nodded, then looked toward Benedict. "Mr. Ashworth, you may begin." Benedict stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. Before discussing the proposed settlement terms, we believe it necessary to bring several matters to the court's attention that directly affect these proceedings." He approached the bench with a thick folder. "The evidence I'm submitting contains proof of ongoing misconduct that has compromised the integrity of this case. Specifically, evidence of a continuing relationship between Ms. Serafina and her former attorney Cashin, and their coordinated efforts to obtain a disproportionate divorce settlement for the business benefit of Meridian Partners." The judge reviewed the documents, then looked towards Serafina. Miss Serafina, before we continue, would you care to respond to these allegations? Serafina stood. Your Honor, Mr. Ashworth is presenting a distorted narrative designed to demonize me while distracting from the real issue, my husband's systematic concealment of marital assets. Do you deny the specific allegations regarding Mr. Cashin and Meridian Partners? Judge Thorne asked directly. Serafina hesitated. My relationship with Mr. Cashin after he withdrew as counsel is irrelevant to these proceedings. Any discussions with Meridian were merely exploratory, contingent on the outcome of this divorce. I see. Judge Thorne made notes. And what about the financial transactions Mr. Ashworth mentioned? The foundation is my project, Serafina said, her voice hardening. Funds were distributed according to established agreements for legitimate charitable purposes, including cash withdrawals totaling $70,000 over the past 6 weeks. That's not, Benedict interjected. Serafina stopped. Those funds were for a special project requiring confidentiality. Judge Thorne raised an eyebrow. Ms. Serafina, are you prepared to provide documentation of this project and how these funds were used? Serafina's hesitation was more obvious this time. I would need time to compile those records, Your Honor. I thought as much. Judge Thorne closed the folder. Based on the evidence before me, I'm prepared to make the following ruling. The prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable. The settlement terms proposed by Mr. Magnus are consistent with that agreement and are hereby approved. A small gasp escaped from Serafina. Magnus remained completely still, expression neutral, though triumph surged through him. Furthermore, Judge Thorne continued, given the evidence of misconduct submitted today, I'm referring the matter of Mr. Cashin's potential ethics violations to the State Bar Association for review. Ms. Serafina, while you're not subject to the same professional standards, I strongly caution that any continued attempts to circumvent this court's orders regarding asset disposition will result in sanctions. She looked directly at Serafina. Do you understand? Serafina nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. Then unless there are other matters to address, this hearing is concluded. Divorce granted on grounds of irreconcilable differences. Mr. Magnus' proposed settlement terms are incorporated into the final decree. Judge Thorne signed the documents before her. Court is adjourned. As the gavel fell, the tension Magnus had maintained for months began to dissipate. It was over. Every calculated step, every strategy, every sacrifice had led to this moment of absolute victory. Benedict squeezed his shoulder. Congratulations, you won. We won, Magnus corrected, gathering his documents. Across the aisle, Serafina stood as if frozen, the reality of her situation seeming to dawn on her. Her gaze found Magnus, burning with a mixture of rage and disbelief. This isn't over, she said as he passed her, voice low and venomous. Magnus stopped, turned to face her fully. Actually, Serafina, it is over. Completely and irrevocably over. Just like us. You took everything from me, she hissed, angry tears glistening in her eyes. No, Magnus replied calmly. I simply ensured you left with what you brought to the marriage, nothing. 2 months later, Magnus learned that Serafina had moved from one financial crisis to another. Garrett's final report revealed the purpose of her cash withdrawals. Gambling, initially a pastime during the marriage that escalated as divorce proceedings deepened. Cashin not only knew but facilitated, introducing her to private games when casinos began restricting her. The headline "Socialite evicted from luxury apartment in financial distress" caught Isadora's attention, which she showed him over lunch. The photograph showed Serafina arguing with the building manager, her third residence in as many months. Her Mercedes had been repossessed for missed payments, and her new job as a consultant for a small event planning company was in jeopardy due to frequent absences. As for Cashin, the ethics hearing had resulted in his forced resignation from the firm, with most clients already having jumped ship. His career, like Serafina's social standing, had been destroyed. Magnus felt no regret. They had tried to take everything from him, not just assets, but his company, his reputation, his future, and he had ensured they both paid the price. He looked out the window of his office at Magnus Enterprises, where rain had stopped and the city gleamed clean in the afternoon sun. A blank canvas, a fresh start. When his phone rang, Magnus saw Claire Preston's name, a business associate Isadora had introduced him to weeks earlier. "Claire," he said, his voice warming involuntarily, "this is unexpected." "Good unexpected or bad unexpected?" she asked, laughter evident in her voice. "Good," he found himself answering honestly. "Definitely good." As they talked, arranging dinner for that evening, Magnus realized he felt something unexpected, anticipation for what came next. The chapter with Serafina was closed. Her story would continue without him, just as his would continue without her. He had won. She had lost. The scales were balanced. And in that balance, he had found the closest thing to justice the world could offer. That's the end of today's story. For more captivating tales, hit subscribe and never miss an episode.